There are some doors in life you walk through 1,000 times without thinking. The front door of your home. The kitchen door is where the smell of coffee greets you every morning. The bedroom door you close every night, feeling safe, feeling whole. But there comes a day nobody prepares you for, when you walk through that door for the very last time. This is the story of Margaret. And the house that held her entire life. The house sat on the corner of Maple Street and 4th Avenue in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't anything you'd find in a magazine. It was a simple 2-story home with white paint that had yellowed over the decades, a porch that creaked in just the right places, and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left, because Harold, Margaret's husband, had backed into it with his truck in 1987 and never quite fixed it right. Margaret always said she loved that crooked mailbox. It's like us, she used to tell Harold. A little bent, a little imperfect, but still standing. Margaret moved into that house in the spring of 1971. She was 24 years old, newly married, and so full of hope that she could barely sleep the first night. She lay in bed next to Harold, staring at the ceiling, whispering, "Harold, we have a house. A real house." Harold mumbled something about the leaky faucet in the bathroom and fell back asleep. But Margaret, she stayed awake. She listened to the house. The way the wind pressed against the windows. The way the pipes hummed softly behind the walls. The way the oak tree in the backyard scratched gently against the roof, like it was saying, "Welcome home." Over the next 52 years, that house became more than wood and brick. It became a living thing. Every wall absorbed a memory. Every corner held a ghost of laughter. The kitchen, oh that kitchen. Margaret could close her eyes and still hear the chaos of Thanksgiving mornings. The turkey too big for the oven. Her daughter, Susan, sneaking bites of pie crust. Her son, David, spilling cranberry sauce on the floor and trying to clean it up with his sock. The living room where Harold used to sit in his recliner every Sunday, pretending to watch football but actually napping. Margaret would cover him with the old blue blanket and whisper, "You're not fooling anyone, Harold." The backyard where she taught her grandchildren to catch fireflies in mason jars on summer evenings. Where she grew tomatoes every year, not because she was particularly good at gardening, but because her mother had grown tomatoes, and her mother's mother before that. Some things you do not because they make sense, but because they connect you to the people you've lost. And the bedroom. The bedroom where Harold took his last breath on a cold February morning in 2019. Where Margaret held his hand and felt the exact moment his grip loosened, and the whole world became quieter. After that, the house felt different. Not smaller, but emptier. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy. It pressed against her chest like a stone. Margaret was 76 when Harold died. She was strong, everyone said so. "Margaret is tough as nails," the neighbors would say. And she was. She mowed her own lawn until she was 78. She drove herself to the grocery store, to church, to her book club every Wednesday at the library. But the body has its own plans. It started with small things. A dizzy spell in the kitchen. Forgetting to turn off the stove. Leaving the front door unlocked overnight, something she never would have done before. Then one evening in October 2023, Margaret tripped on the edge of the hallway rug, the same rug that had been there for 30 years without causing a single problem, and fell. She hit the floor hard. Her hip exploded in pain. She lay there on the cold hardwood floor, staring up at the ceiling she had stared at on her very first night in that house. But this time, there was no hope keeping her awake. Just pain. And fear. She reached for her phone, but it was on the kitchen counter. She tried to crawl, but the pain was blinding. Margaret lay on that floor for 6 hours. She watched the light change through the windows. The sunset painted the walls gold, then orange, then deep purple. Then everything went dark. It was her neighbor, Tom, who found her. He'd noticed her porch light wasn't on. Margaret always turned on her porch light, and came to check. When the paramedics carried her out, Margaret looked back at her front door, still open, the hallway light spilling out into the night. She didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of the end. The hip surgery went well, the doctors said. But recovery at her age would be long. And the other things, the forgetfulness, the dizziness, the blood pressure that swung like a pendulum, those painted a bigger picture. Susan flew in from Denver. David drove down from Chicago. They sat in the hospital room, trying to look calm, trying not to cry, and Margaret saw right through them. "Just say it," she said. Susan looked at David. David looked at the floor. "Mom," Susan started, her voice already cracking, "we've been talking, and we think maybe it's time to consider." "An old folks' home," Margaret said flatly. "It's not called that anymore, Mom. It's an assisted living community. Sunrise Gardens. It's beautiful. They have activities and a garden and—" "I have a garden." Silence. David leaned forward. "Mom, you were on the floor for 6 hours. 6 hours. What if Tom hadn't come? What if I'd died?" Margaret said. "Then I'd have died in my own house. On my own floor. Near my own things. That doesn't sound so terrible to me." Susan started crying then. Not the quiet, dignified crying she usually did, but the messy kind. The kind that comes from deep inside. "Mom, please. I can't go to sleep at night knowing you're alone in that house. I can't. Every time my phone rings after 9 p.m., my heart stops. I think this is it. This is the call. I can't live like that, Mom. I can't." Margaret looked at her daughter. At the dark circles under her eyes. The way her hands trembled. And she realized something that broke her heart more than leaving the house ever could. Her independence had become her children's prison. She closed her eyes. "Okay," she whispered. "Just one word." But it cost her everything. They gave her 3 weeks to pack. 3 weeks to decide what 52 years of life fit into a single room at Sunrise Gardens. 1 room. 1 closet. 1 window. Susan made lists. David brought boxes. They tried to be efficient, practical, organized. But how do you organize a life? Margaret stood in the kitchen, holding a coffee mug, Harold's mug, the one that said "World's okayest husband" that David had given him as a joke 15 years ago. Harold had used it every single morning. The handle was chipped. The print was faded. It was, by any objective measure, just a mug. But when Margaret held it, she could feel Harold's hand. She could hear him laughing at the joke the first time he read it. She could smell the black coffee he drank, no sugar, no cream, because Harold said that was ruining perfectly good coffee. "You can bring it with you, Mom," Susan said gently. Margaret nodded and placed it in the keep box. But for every item she kept, there were 100 she couldn't. The dining table where they'd shared 10,000 meals. The bookshelf Harold built, badly, their first year in the house, the one that leaned slightly to the right, just like the mailbox. The rocking chair in the nursery where she'd nursed both her babies, singing the same lullaby her mother had sung to her. Each object she touched was a thread, and letting go felt like unraveling. The hardest was the bedroom closet. Harold's side was still exactly as he'd left it. His flannel shirts. His old work boots. His leather belt, cracked and worn. Margaret hadn't moved any of it in 4 years. Susan stood in the doorway. "Mom, do you want me to?" "No," Margaret said. "I'll do it." She took each shirt off the hanger slowly, folding it the way Harold liked, which was not the way you're supposed to fold a shirt, but it was his way. She brought each one to her face and breathed in. Most of them just smelled like closet now. Like dust and cedar. But one, the red flannel, his favorite, still held the faintest trace of his cologne. Old Spice. The one he'd worn since he was 18 years old. Margaret pressed that shirt to her chest and sat on the edge of the bed and cried. Not for the house. Not for the move. For the man who was supposed to grow old with her. Who was supposed to be sitting next to her, holding her hand, saying, "It'll be all right, Maggie. We'll figure it out. We always do." But Harold was gone. And now the house was going too. And Margaret felt, for the first time in her life, truly homeless, not because she had nowhere to go, but because the place where she belonged no longer existed. The moving truck came on a Tuesday, November 14th. It was cold, and the sky was that flat, colorless gray that makes everything look tired. Margaret woke up early, 5:15 a.m., the same time she'd been waking up for 50 years. Force of habit. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. She made coffee in the empty kitchen. The counters were bare. The refrigerator was unplugged, its door propped open. The only sound was the coffee maker, the old one, the one that gurgled and sputtered like it was complaining. She poured the coffee into Harold's mug and walked through the house one last time. The living room. Empty now, except for the marks on the carpet where the furniture had stood. She could see the outline of Harold's recliner, a perfect rectangle pressed into the carpet, like a ghost. She stood there for a long moment, staring at that rectangle. "I miss you," she said to the empty room. "Every single day, I miss you." She walked upstairs. The kids' rooms. Susan's room still had the height marks on the doorframe, pencil lines with dates. Susan, age 5. Susan, age 7. Susan, age 10. They went up and up, a ladder of years. David's room had a dent in the wall from when he'd thrown a baseball inside the house, and Harold had been furious, for about 10 minutes, until David started crying, and then Harold felt so guilty he took him for ice cream. Margaret touched the dent. Smiled. She walked into the master bedroom. The room where it all happened, the love, the fights, the laughter, the grief. She stood at the window and looked out at the backyard. The oak tree was bare now. The garden was asleep for winter. The old swing set, rusted, unused for 20 years, still stood in the corner like a monument to childhood. She pressed her hand against the window. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for holding us." Susan and David arrived at 8. The movers came at 9. By 11, everything that was going was in the truck. Everything that wasn't was labeled for donation or disposal. Margaret stood on the front porch. The same porch where she'd watched her children ride bikes for the first time. Where she'd waited for Harold to come home from work. Where she'd sat with her coffee every morning for half a century, waving at neighbors, watching the seasons change. "Mom, are you ready?" David asked. Margaret looked at the front door. The paint was peeling. The doorknob was loose. It had been loose for years. She'd always meant to fix it. She reached out and touched the door. Ran her fingers across the wood. Then she did something no one expected. She leaned forward and kissed the doorframe. "Goodbye, old friend," she said softly. David turned away. He couldn't watch. Susan grabbed her mother's hand and squeezed. Margaret walked down the porch steps, slowly, carefully, one at a time. At the bottom, she turned around one last time. The house looked the same. White paint, crooked mailbox, creaky porch. It didn't know she was leaving. It would go on standing there, holding its memories inside its walls, even when someone else moved in and painted over the pencil marks and fixed the dent in David's wall and straightened the mailbox. The house would forget her. But she would never forget the house. She got into Susan's car, buckled her seatbelt, and looked straight ahead. "Don't look back, Maggie," she told herself. Something Harold used to say whenever they drove away from something sad. "Don't look back, Maggie. Only the road ahead matters." But she did look back. Just once. In the side mirror. And the house got smaller and smaller and smaller, until it was just a white, and then nothing at all. Sunrise Gardens was fine. That was the word Margaret used. Fine. The room was clean. The bed was comfortable. The staff was kind. There were activities, bingo on Mondays, movie nights on Thursdays, a garden club that met on Saturday mornings. But it wasn't home. It would never be home. Her first night there, Margaret lay in her new bed, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling. The sounds were wrong. No oak tree is scratching the roof. No pipes humming. Just the beep of machines down the hall, and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes on linoleum. She reached over to the nightstand and picked up Harold's mug. She hadn't made coffee in it yet. She just held it. "Well, Harold," she said to the dark room. "Here we are." She waited, as if expecting an answer. The silence was enormous. "I brought your shirts," she continued. "And the photo album. And that stupid crooked mailbox. Well, not the actual mailbox, but I took a picture of it. David thought I was crazy." She paused. "Maybe I am crazy." Crazy old woman talking to her dead husband in an old folks' home. She smiled. A small, sad, beautiful smile. "But you know what, Harold? If you were here, you'd say something dumb like, 'At least we don't have to mow the lawn anymore.' And I'd pretend to be annoyed, but I'd laugh. I always laughed." She set the mug down and pulled the blanket up to her chin. It wasn't the old blue blanket. That was gone. Donated. Covering some stranger now. Margaret closed her eyes. "Good night, house," she whispered. "Good night, Harold. Good night, everything." Weeks passed. Margaret went through the motions. She ate in the dining hall. She attended activities. She smiled when people smiled at her. She was polite, because Margaret had always been polite. But inside, she was shrinking. Like a plant pulled from its soil, she was wilting in real time. The staff noticed. Susan noticed during her weekly visits. Even the other residents noticed. "You're the new one, right?" said a woman named Ruth, who was 83 and had been at Sunrise Gardens for 2 years. Ruth had bright eyes and a sharp tongue and absolutely no filter.
"I'm Margaret.
I know who you are. You're the one who sits by the window all day looking like someone cancelled Christmas." Margaret blinked. I beg your pardon?" Ruth sat down across from her uninvited. "Let me guess. The house. You miss the house." Margaret said nothing. "We all miss the house, sweetheart. Every single person in this building had a house. Had a life. Had a kitchen that smelled like something wonderful. You're not special." Margaret felt a flash of anger. Then, unexpectedly, a flash of recognition. "So what do you do?" Margaret asked. How do you live with it?" Ruth leaned forward. "You want to know my secret?" "Yes." "I stopped trying to live there and started trying to live here." Ruth pointed at the ground. "Right here. This ugly carpet. This mediocre coffee. These people who chew too loud at breakfast. This is my life now. And I decided, Margaret, that it was going to be a good one. Not the same one. Not the one I planned. But a good one." Margaret stared at Ruth for a long time. "That sounds exhausting," she said. Ruth burst out laughing. A real, full, loud laugh that turned heads across the room. "I like you, Margaret," Ruth said. "Come to Garden Club on Saturday. I'll show you where they keep the good tomato seeds." Margaret almost said no. Almost. But then she thought of her mother's garden. And her grandmother's garden. And the tomatoes in the backyard on Maple Street that she grew not because she was good at it, but because it connected her to the people she'd lost. "Okay," she said. Just one word. But this time, it didn't cost her everything. This time, it gave her something back. 6 months after moving to Sunrise Gardens, Margaret sat in the small community garden, her hands covered in dirt, a flat of tomato seedlings in front of her. Ruth was beside her, arguing with another resident named Frank about the proper depth for planting. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from Susan with a photo. It was the house. The house on Maple Street. The new owners had painted it blue. They'd fixed the mailbox, it stood straight now. There was a tricycle on the front porch and a small dog in the yard. Margaret stared at the photo for a long time. She expected to cry. She waited for the grief to hit her like a wave. But instead, something strange happened. She smiled. The house was alive again. Children were running through those rooms. A dog was barking in that yard. Someone was making new memories in that kitchen, burning toast, spilling coffee, laughing too loud. The house hadn't died when she left. It had just started a new chapter. That night, Margaret sat at her small desk and wrote a letter. She didn't know who she was writing it to, exactly. The new owners, maybe. Or the house itself. Or Harold. Or maybe just herself. Dear home. I lived inside your walls for 52 years. You held my family when we were whole and held me when I was broken. You kept the rain off our heads and the cold from our bones. You were the background to every important moment of my life. The births, the birthdays, the ordinary Tuesdays that turned out to be the most precious days of all. I want you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than losing Harold, because when I lost him, I still had you. When I lost you, I lost the last place where I could still feel him. But I'm learning something, slowly. Home isn't a place. I know people say that and it sounds like something you'd read on a decorative pillow, but it's true. Home is the feeling of being known. Of being safe. Of belonging. I found a little bit of that here. There's a woman named Ruth who makes me laugh. There's a garden where I grow tomatoes. There's a mug on my nightstand that still connects me to the man I love. I carry you with me. Every room, every wall, every creak and crack and imperfection. You live inside me now, the way I once lived inside you. Thank you for everything. With all my love. Margaret. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer next to Harold's mug. She never sent it. She didn't need to. Some letters are written not to be read, but to be released. There are millions of Margarets in this world. Right now tonight, someone's grandmother is sleeping in an unfamiliar bed, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, holding something small, a mug, a photograph, a folded shirt, and whispering good night to a house that can no longer hear her. They are not statistics. They are not the elderly. They are women who danced in their kitchens. Men who built bookshelves with their own hands. Parents who stayed up all night with sick children. Lovers who whispered promises in the dark. They are people who lived, fully, messily, beautifully, and then one day were asked to fit that entire life into a single room. If you have a Margaret in your life, a grandmother, a grandfather, a parent, a neighbor, call them. Visit them. Sit with them. Ask them about the house. Ask them about the crooked mailbox and the dent in the wall and the oak tree that scratched the roof at night. Let them tell you their stories. Because one day, those stories will be all that's left. And they deserve to be heard.